Welcome back to the Deep Dive, the place where we take complex biochemistry and distill it into the essential knowledge you need to be informed and fluent in metabolic science.
Today, we're focusing on gluconeogenesis, or GNG. That's the synthesis of new glucose from non-carbohydrate precursors.
And if you want to understand metabolism, diabetes, and frankly, human resilience, this pathway is absolutely foundational.
It really is. I mean, we're not talking about an optional pathway here.
Not at all. This is a non-negotiable requirement for survival. When you're fasting, sleeping, or running a marathon, your nervous system and your red blood cells, they demand a constant, steady supply of glucose.
And if GNG fails, the supply just drops.
And the outcome is devastating. We're talking hypoglycemia, brain dysfunction, coma, and, ultimately death.
That's the high-stakes reality.
Yeah.
But its importance goes beyond just feeding the brain. It also serves this vital recycling function. It's sort of like the body's metabolic cleanup crew.
Cleanup crew, how do you mean?
Well, think about what happens during intense exercise. Your muscles produce lactate. Your red blood cells are always producing it. GNG takes that lactate and converts it right back into usable glucose. It does the same thing with glycerol, which gets released when your body breaks down fat.
So it's both recycling waste and generating essential fuel at the same time. That's incredibly efficient.
Exactly. It clears out these intermediates so they don't build up to problematic levels.
And just how critical is GNG when we say, stop eating for a while?
After a normal overnight fast, it's about a 50-50 split.
Yeah.
Half your glucose comes from GNG and the other half from breaking down liver glycogen.
Okay.
But as that fast progresses, maybe past 24 hours, your glycogen reserves are gone. GNG takes over completely, becomes the only source.
And this is all happening mostly in the liver, I assume?
Primarily in the liver, yes. It's the central hub. But what's really interesting is that as starvation goes on, the kidneys really step up.
The kidneys.
Yeah, they can contribute up to 40% of total glucose synthesis. They become a major player when the body is desperate for fuel.
It sounds like a perfect system, but obviously things can go wrong. Where does it become pathological?
When it's overactive, pathological excess GNG is a huge problem in two main scenarios. First, in critically ill patients.
From injury or infection.
Right. The stress response drives GNG way too high, and that leads to severe hyperglycemia.
And what's so dangerous about high blood sugar in that state?
Well, it leads to really poor outcomes. It messes with fluid balance in the body, it impairs blood flow, and it ramps up the production of damaging molecules like superoxide radicals.
And then the second scenario.
That would be type 2 diabetes. Excessive GNG is a key reason for the high blood sugar we see there. The pathway basically fails to shut down because the cells are resistant to insulin signals.
Okay, let's unpack that. Let's get into the chemistry. We know glycolysis breaks glucose down and gluconeogenesis builds it up. They share most of the same pathway. So what prevents a wasteful, futile cycle where we're just burning ATP to run the reactions forward and backward?
The body's way too smart for that. Glycolysis has 3 steps that are so energetically favorable, so far downhill, that they're basically thermodynamically irreversible.
One-way streets.
Exactly. So to go in reverse, GNG has to build, let's say, 4 specialized chemical bridges or bypasses using unique enzymes that only go in the up direction.
Let's start with the toughest one, the first barrier, getting from pyruvate all the way back up to phosphoenolpyruvate, or PP.
Right. This is definitely the most complex bypass. And that's mainly because it involves a change of location. It actually happens across the mitochondrial membrane.
So it's a 2-part process.
It is. First, you get pyruvate into the mitochondrion. Inside, an enzyme called pyruvate carboxylase converts it into oxaloacetate, or OAA.
And that costs energy.
It does. It's an ATP expensive reaction. And it uses the vitamin biotin to grab a carbon dioxide molecule and stick it on.
So now we have OAA inside the mitochondrion, but OAA can't just walk out into the cytosol where the rest of the pathway is.
It can't. It needs a special delivery system.
Yeah.
OAA is temporarily converted to malate, which can be exported. Then, once it's in the cytosol, it's converted right back to OAA.
The OAA shuttle.
That's the one. And once it's outside, the second enzyme, PEP carboxykinase, takes over. It converts that OAA into PEP, using GTP as the energy source.
And that whole cross-membrane step is actually a really clever internal control check, isn't it?
It is, because the GTP that's used in that second step is often linked to its production in the citric acid cycle. This ensures GNG doesn't pull too much OAA away from the cell's main energy-producing cycle. It's all connected.
Okay, so we've bypassed the first big roadblock. Let's keep climbing the ladder. What's the second wall we hit?
That would be the step controlled by phosphofructokinase 1 in glycolysis. GNG bypasses this with an enzyme called fructose 1-6-bisphosphate.
And what does it do?
It does something very simple. It just removes a phosphate group, converting fructose 1-6-bisphosphate back to fructose 6-phosphate.
And the presence of that one enzyme is the gatekeeper. It decides if a cell can even do this, right?
Exactly right. If a tissue has fructose 1,6-bisphosphatase, like the liver, kidney, or even skeletal muscle, it can proceed with GNG. But tissues like the heart or smooth muscles, they lack it. They're dependent on external glucose.
Okay, final barrier. At the very end of a line, getting free glucose out of the cell.
For that, you need glucose-6-phosphatase. It removes the very last phosphate group, yielding free glucose that can diffuse out into the bloodstream.
And this is the truly crucial insight. The location of that enzyme tells you everything about the body's glucose hierarchy.
It really does. Because glucose-6-phosphatase is present in the liver and the kidney, but it is absent from muscle tissue.
So muscle can't take the phosphate off.
It can't. This means muscle can make glucose-6-phosphate for its own use, for its own energy needs, but it cannot release free glucose into the blood to help other tissues.
Only the liver and kidney have that privilege.
That's right. They retain the exclusive right to act as glucose exporters for the rest of the body.
Okay, so now we understand the chemical bypasses. Where does the body actually get the raw materials, the carbon for GNG, when we haven't eaten?
The precursors come from a surprisingly wide range of sources. You can basically group them into two categories.
Okay.
There are those derived from things like protein, so most amino acids, and then there are those that are recycled from glucose metabolism itself, like lactate and glycerol.
Let's talk about those recycling loops. You mentioned lactate cleanup. What's the full name for that system?
That's the very elegant Cori cycle. Sometimes it's called the lactic acid cycle.
Right.
So lactate, which is pouring out of your exercising muscles and your red blood cells, travels through the blood to the liver. The liver then spends the energy to run GNG, turns that lactate back into new glucose,
And sends it right back out into circulation.
immediately to refuel those very same tissues. It's a constant vital loop.
Okay, and what about protein? Does the body really start cannibalizing muscle just to feed the brain?
It does, but in a very controlled way. It's called the glucose-alanine cycle. During a fast, skeletal muscle begins to break down protein. The amino acid alanine is specifically formed.
From pyruvate, right?
Exactly, from pyruvate that might have come from the muscle's own glycogen stores. This alanine is then exported to the liver.
And why alanine? Why that one specifically?
Because alanine is a safe, non-toxic way to transport nitrogen. The liver takes the alanine, converts it back to pyruvate for GNG, and at the same time, it can process that nitrogen safely into urea for excretion.
So it's an indirect but effective way to use muscle protein to keep the brain fueled during a long fast.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And then, of course, there's the fat component.
Visceral.
Don't forget glycerol. When you break down fat, the glycerol backbone is released. The liver and kidneys are the only organs with the enzyme to use it, and they take that glycerol and plug it right into the GNG pathway.
You also mentioned propionate, which sounds a little obscure.
It's minor in humans, yeah, but it's worth mentioning. It mostly comes from breaking down fatty acids with an odd number of carbons or certain amino acids.
How does it get into the pathway?
It enters via the citric acid cycle.
Okay.
But the key thing here is the enzyme it requires. It's called methylmalonyl-CoA mutase, and it's dependent on vitamin B12.
Ah, so a B12 deficiency would show up here.
Precisely. You'd see a condition called methylmalonic aciduria, which is a key clinical sign that this specific part of the pathway has failed.
Okay, we have the building blocks, we have the bypasses. Now, the core of this, regulation. Since these two pathways are opposites, their control has to be reciprocal. When one is on, the other has to be off.
And this regulation happens on 3 different timescales. You have slow, long-term genetic control, you have rapid hormonal control, and then you have instantaneous, moment-to-moment allosteric control.
Let's start with the slow game, changing the actual amount of enzyme in the cell.
All right, this is enzyme synthesis. It takes hours or days. In the fed state, when you've just eaten, high insulin turns on the genes for glycolytic enzymes and actively shuts down the genes for GNG enzymes.
And the reverse happens when you're fasting.
Exactly. When blood glucose drops, hormones like glucagon and glucocorticoids tell the cell to start making the entire suite of GNG enzymes: PPCK, pyruvate carboxylase, glucose-6-phosphatase, preparing the liver for a long haul of glucose production.
Now for the faster response. Hormonal action, phosphorylation.
Covalent modification. When blood glucose drops, glucagon and epinephrine levels rise. This increases KMP, which activates a protein kinase.
And what does that kinase do?
It acts very quickly. It adds a phosphate group to pyruvate kinase, the final enzyme in glycolysis, and that inactivates it
So it shuts the door on glucose consumption right at the end of the line.
instantly, pushing the whole system back towards GNG.
And now for the most elegant switch, the instantaneous one, the one driven by the cell's own energy status.
Allosteric regulation. And it's beautiful because it links fat burning directly to glucose production. Remember pyruvate carboxylase, that very first GNG enzyme?
Yeah.
It absolutely requires acetyl-CoA as an allosteric activator. It will not work without it.
So what does that mean in a fasting state?
During a fast, you're burning a lot of fat that produces a ton of acetyl-CoA. The moment the body switches to fat for fuel, that flood of acetyl-CoA automatically flips the GNG switch to on-N.
Wow.
And at the same time, that acetyl-CoA inhibits the enzyme that would otherwise burn pyruvate for energy. So fatty acid oxidation literally pays the massive ATP energy bill required to run GNG, all while ensuring we spare what little glucose we have.
That is the ultimate metabolic optimization. Fat pays the bill so we can make sugar for the brain.
Precisely. And another key allosteric point is phosphofructokinase 1, PFK1, the main control point in glycolysis.
Right.
PFK1 is inhibited by high ATP and high citrate. These are signals that the cell is flush with energy. But that inhibition is reversed by 5-FOXP8, which is a signal of low energy.
And this is where that AMP amplifier concept comes in, which is so cool.
It is. Imagine your cell's energy currency, ATP. If the level of ATP drops just a tiny bit, say by 1%.
Which seems insignificant.
But a special reaction kicks in that causes a huge, several-fold surge in the concentration of 5-foot AMP. That massive spike in AMP acts like a metabolic panic button, powerfully activating PFK1 to ramp up glycolysis and restore the cell's energy.
Let's zoom in on the most potent regulator of all, especially in the liver. Fructose 2006-bisphosphate, or 2006-6-BP-T.
This molecule is the central command. It is the most potent positive activator of PFK1, so it screams go for glycolysis. And at the same time, it's a potent inhibitor of fructose 1-Evo6-bisphosphatase, so it screams S-top to GNG.
So the concentration of this one single molecule dictates the direction of the entire pathway.
It does, and the genius is how its concentration is controlled. It's done by a single, unique, bifunctional enzyme.
An enzyme with two opposing activities built in.
Exactly. It has a kinase part that makes CYP2006-BP and a phosphatase part that breaks it down.
So walk us through it. When we eat, glucose is high. What happens?
High glucose leads to an increase in fructose-6-phosphate, which stimulates the kinase part of that bifunctional enzyme. 2006-BP8 levels shoot up, powerfully activating glycolysis and shutting down GNG. The cell goes into storage mode.
And the exact opposite happens when the fasting alarm bell, glucagon, rings.
Precisely. Glucagon activates a kinase that phosphorylates the bifunctional enzyme, and that phosphorylation acts like a switch. It turns off the kinase part and turns on the phosphatase part.
So F2006-BPTA levels plummet.
They plummet. And with that master inhibitor gone, GNG turns on and glycolysis shuts off. It's an instantaneous, elegant reversal of metabolic flow.
Okay, let's zoom back out to the organ level. We keep our blood glucose in this incredibly narrow range, around 4.5 to 5.5 millimoles per liter. This whole system really depends on the liver acting as the primary sensor.
And that sensing ability comes down to its special enzyme, glucokinase. Unlike the normal hexokinase, glucokinase has a high comolar. It has a very low affinity for glucose.
So it's not very grabby.
Not at all. Hexokinase is always working at full tilt, meeting the cell's basic needs. But glucokinase's activity only really ramps up when portal vein glucose is super high, like right after a big meal.
So the flood control mechanism.
Exactly. It allows the liver to rapidly take up and store huge amounts of glucose, preventing your peripheral blood sugar from soaring out of control. It switches the liver from a net producer of glucose to a net consumer.
And the ultimate command comes from insulin and glucagon. Insulin signals abundance.
Right. It's secreted in response to high blood sugar. Its most immediate effect is to recruit GLUT4 transporters to the surface of muscle and fat cells. It's like opening the floodgates for glucose to rush in from the blood.
And glucagon is the opposite. It's the alarm for low blood sugar.
It's secreted during hypoglycemia. It does the opposite of insulin. It stimulates the liver to break down glycogen, and critically, it ramps up GNG to produce new glucose and release it into the blood.
And there are other hormones in play too, right?
Yes. Things like growth hormone, and especially glucocorticoids. They antagonize insulin. Glucocorticoids, like cortisol, crank up GNG by promoting the breakdown of amino acids in the liver, providing more fuel for the fire.
Okay, let's tie all this to the clinical side. What are some real-world examples our listeners might see?
A classic one is glucosuria glucose in the urine. This happens when blood glucose gets too high, usually over 10 millimoles per liter. The kidneys just can't reabsorb all the filtered glucose, and the excess spills out. It's a hallmark of uncontrolled diabetes.
You also mentioned that premature babies are at high risk for hypoglycemia. Why is that from a G&G perspective?
It comes back to the energy cost.
Yeah.
G&G is hugely expensive in terms of ATP,
Right.
and that ATP has to be generated by burning fatty acids. Premature babies often lack enough body fat, so they don't have the fuel to power G&G. Combine that with potentially immature enzymes, and their defense against low blood sugar is very fragile.
And the glucose tolerance test, what is that really measuring?
It's a measure of this whole system's efficiency. Impaired tolerance shows a failure of regulation. In type 1 diabetes, it's a failure to secrete insulin. In type 2, it's a failure of the tissues to respond to insulin resistance.
Which can lead to metabolic syndrome.
Exactly. When that insulin resistance is tied to obesity, high blood lipids, and atherosclerosis, that's what we call the metabolic syndrome.
And finally, there's a connection to low-carb diets here, isn't there?
There is. By removing dietary carbs, you force the body to run G&G constantly, mostly from amino acids. And since G&G costs so much ATP, the body is forced to continually burn fatty acids to pay that energy bill. It makes fat burning mandatory.
So at the end of the day, what does this all mean? The control of blood glucose isn't just about what you eat. It's a constant dynamic negotiation between supply and demand.
Absolutely. The intricate bypasses, the recycling loops, the layered regulation.
Yeah.
It shows that maintaining glucose homeostasis is arguably one of the most critical metabolic challenges the body faces.
So the key takeaways for you listening are these. First, G&G isn't just glycolysis in reverse. It uses 4 specific enzymes to bypass those 3 irreversible steps.
Second, the regulation is reciprocal. It's driven by instantaneous energy signals, like that AMP switch, and by longer-term hormonal controls, like glucagon.
And third, the liver's low-affinity glucokinase is the critical sensor. It's the floodgate that protects the rest of the body from dangerous glucose spikes after a meal.
Exactly.
Given the body's magnificent and elegant systems for making and saving glucose, we'll leave you with this final thought. What happens to this precise metabolic balance when chronic inflammation and the sustained high levels of glucocorticoids that come with it shifts from being an acute, temporary response to a perpetual, ongoing state?
Thank you for joining us for this deep dive into the world of gluconeogenesis and metabolic survival.